Reality television has a way of making people look invincible. The cameras roll, the personalities fill the screen, and the audience gets comfortable with the idea that these people will always be right there where they left them. Storage Wars ran for over a decade on that exact formula, and most fans never thought to wonder what the show was costing the people in it. Some of them were fighting illnesses the production never mentioned. One was 2 days from a fatal heart attack and had no idea. Another survived a shooting at 22 years old with a bullet still sitting in his spine. And one cast member, beloved by nearly everyone on that set, ended up dead in his vehicle. What happened to the Storage Wars cast after the cameras stopped is a story the show never told, and it went places nobody planned for. Mo Prigo spent 6 years losing a battle against serious illness, and almost none of his fans knew any of it was happening. He came to the show not as a professional collector, but as a working podiatrist, 45 years in the field, practicing out of North Oak Cliff and Dallas, right alongside a mid-century modern furniture store he owned and ran called River Regency. The store drew customers who knew what they were looking for, pieces from the 1950s through the 1970s, and Prigo had the kind of eye that comes from decades of genuine knowledge rather than casual interest. His longtime friendship with Barry Weiss is what brought him to television in the first place, appearing as a recurring buyer on Storage Wars Texas, and once he was on camera, audiences responded to him the way people respond to someone who simply doesn't have a bad day on screen. He never picked fights, never played to the villain edit, never made things harder than they needed to be. He showed up, bid on what he loved, and treated everyone around him with ease. After 6 quiet years of illness, he passed away on March 4, 2021, at 78 years old, and the details of his fight never made it into any headline. Brandon Sheets built his following on the main show, bidding alongside his father, Daryl, and then in 2017, A&E went through a round of budget cuts and removed Brandon from the payroll while keeping Daryl on the same show. No final episode, no acknowledgement, just a name that stopped appearing on the call sheet. Brandon moved into real estate after that and eventually took a long-haul driving position with UPS, which is where the next chapter found him. In 2024, he was asleep in the sleeper berth of a semi-truck when a fill-in co-driver struck another vehicle at 70 miles per hour, and he woke up to what he later described as a bomb going off around him. He was treated at a hospital in Texas and transported to Arizona to recover, and what followed the physical recovery was its own separate ordeal, because Brandon stated publicly that UPS had not paid workers' compensation and had not covered his personal property destroyed in the crash. No management behind him, no production platform, no industry support of any kind. He pushed for better safety protocols through his own social media and handled all of it alone. Brandy Passante was part of Storage Wars from the very first season, and the dynamic she built with Jared Schultz became one of the central reasons audiences kept returning. A&E formalized that in 2014 with a spin-off called Brandy and Jared Married to the Job, an inaccurate title since the two were never married, and the spin-off ran 8 episodes before ending. What the cameras never covered was what the attention was actually doing to her life. Early in her time on television, letters began arriving at her home address, not fan mail, but threatening correspondence serious enough that she contacted authorities. The volume and content were bad enough that staying in the house became impossible. She relocated to a gated community, changed her routines, and started limiting her movements in ways that most people would find exhausting to sustain. Seeing a therapist became part of how she managed the anxiety the public exposure had created. By 2020, she and Schultz had already separated. She was raising their children full-time, and then the domestic violence charge involving Schultz that arrived in 2021 landed on top of a situation that had already been grinding her down for years. In a 2020 interview, she described the adjustment as something that required real, sustained help to get through. Dave Hester spent most of his time on Storage Wars accumulating enemies, and when A&E fired him before Season 4 in 2012 after his public claim that the show was staged, he filed a wrongful termination lawsuit seeking $750,000 in damages. The case was dismissed, then reinstated, then settled out of court for an undisclosed amount, and Hester returned for Season 5 and stayed through Season 11. None of that resolved the legal troubles permanently. In 2020, a California appeals court ruled against him in a separate case involving a storage unit he had purchased for $12,000 that Public Storage had listed in error, and once the court established the unit still legally belonged to its original owner, Hester was ordered to return everything inside it. The $12,000 was gone. Then, entirely apart from the legal battles, he woke up one night unable to breathe, triggering a hemorrhagic stroke, the kind caused by bleeding in the brain rather than a blockage and carrying a higher fatality rate than the more common variety. Hester had undiagnosed sleep apnea the entire time and had no reason to suspect it. He survived all of it. Barry Weiss had already left Storage Wars years before April 2019, having done his own spin-off, and then walked away from television entirely to return to motorcycles and rare cars on his own schedule. That April, he and his friend Jaime were riding through the Los Feliz neighborhood of Los Angeles when a car pulled out of a parking lot and struck them. Jaime broke his knee, elbow, and wrist. Weiss went to the ICU with serious damage to his femur and back, requiring multiple surgeries. Jaime posted on Instagram while Weiss was still in the operating room, telling followers about the serious chest and leg trauma and asking for prayers. Weeks in the hospital followed, then an extended rehabilitation process. When Weiss came back to Storage Wars in 2021, he arrived at an auction in a 1939 Lincoln Zephyr he had sourced himself, got out, and went straight back to work. Daryl Sheets was carrying a story from 1988 that predated the show by more than 2 decades and that he only recounted on camera because interviewers kept asking about it. That year, long before any production crew knew his name, he opened a storage unit in San Diego and found a body inside. He described it on camera as not pleasant and said he preferred not to go further. But in a 2012 interview, he added what police had told him at the time. The body was a woman killed by her husband, and the unit was connected to an active occult investigation. Detectives seized the locker and took everything inside as evidence, including items Sheets had already begun sorting through. He was not compensated for the unit he had purchased, and walked away with nothing but the memory. Then, in March 2019, at a Justin Timberlake concert, the symptoms of a heart attack began. Months of not feeling right had not pushed him toward a doctor, and at the hospital, doctors found his left anterior descending artery was 95% blocked, discovered a lung infection, and confirmed he was diabetic. Surgeons placed 2 stents and treated him for congestive heart failure. The blockage was the type cardiologists call the widowmaker, and Sheets had been 1 or 2 days from dying without ever feeling seriously ill. He had also suffered 2 heart attacks back-to-back, not one. Gunter Nazoda arrived on Storage Wars in 2015 as the father of cast member Renee Nazoda, and he became one of the most genuinely liked people ever connected to the show. Before reaching American television in his 60s, he had spent decades in Austria working simultaneously as a musician, photographer, and low-budget film actor, with credits alongside Pat Travers and George Lynch, doing session photography for touring acts and appearing in European productions across 3 disciplines over several decades. Even Dave Hester, who had built his entire Storage Wars identity around making things harder for everyone around him, dropped that entirely when Gunter was present. Hester told Renee that if his father wanted a locker, he would not bid against him. In September 2022, after 30 years of smoking, Gunter was diagnosed with lung cancer, and his lungs had deteriorated past the point where treatment could offer anything useful. He died in Salt Lake City on March 2023 at 67 years old. Renee posted a video on Instagram the same day, speaking directly to the fans who had followed his appearances because she felt they had earned that news directly. Dan Dodson was the auctioneer, the voice that could silence a room full of competitive buyers inside 10 seconds, and he and his wife Laura had been running American Auctioneers together long before the show put them on television. In June 2014, that voice nearly stopped permanently. Laura noticed something was wrong the night before it happened, when Dan started asking questions in bed that made no sense, and the next morning he got out of the shower and collapsed. She and their son performed mouth-to-mouth resuscitation on the floor while they waited for the ambulance, and at the hospital doctors found 2 brain aneurysms that had caused a subarachnoid hemorrhage. His odds of surviving surgery were 20%. He came through it, and his neurologist credited the absence of severe internal bleeding as the key factor. From his hospital bed that same week, Dan told Laura he was done smoking. After months of neurological rehabilitation, he returned to the auction floor at the same pace and volume that had defined his work for decades, and American Auctioneers has continued running ever since. Garrett Dodson, Dan and Laura's son, was 22 years old in 2020 when a man named Garrett Wilder stopped his car and began shouting at him from the vehicle in Lake Havasu City, Arizona. When Garrett approached, Wilder shot him in the torso. The bullet ruptured his vena cava, and he was bleeding internally within minutes. Garrett called 911 himself, was airlifted to Las Vegas, and during the flight, a doctor climbed onto the gurney, straddled him, and pressed both hands directly into the wound for the entire journey from Lake Havasu City to Las Vegas to keep him alive. Garrett survived the surgery, though the bullet remained lodged in his L3 vertebra. He wore a back brace for 8 weeks, and the financial aftermath he described as devastating, saying the airlift alone, the emergency surgery, and the extended recovery generated bills that took years to work through. He was 22, had no preparation for that level of medical debt, and spoke openly about it because he wanted people to understand that surviving the shooting was only the beginning of what it cost him. Garrett Wilder was convicted of drive-by shooting and is currently serving 10.5 years. He is the only person connected to the Storage Wars franchise confirmed behind bars in 2026, and he was never on the show. Jared Schultz and Brandy Passanti were together from the first season, shared a spin-off, had children together, and separated quietly by 2020, with the split not made public until the season 13 premiere in 2021. On April 30th of that year, they crossed paths at a bar in Orange County, California, and according to prosecutors, a verbal argument turned physical. Schultz left before police arrived, and no arrest was made that night. The Orange County District Attorney's Office later confirmed a charge of 1 count of misdemeanor domestic violence battery. Schultz denied any physical contact occurred, and his attorney stated he intended to fight the charge. A&E launched an internal investigation and kept him off season 14 while it ran. Passanti returned for that season without him. As of 2026, the legal proceedings remain publicly unresolved, with no conviction and no confirmed dismissal. Passanti did not respond through any formal statement. She posted a photo of a tattoo on her wrist, the word "reading free," and wrote in the caption about escaping a situation many people never manage to leave and about living without fear. Schultz has not appeared on Storage Wars since 2021. Mark Bolello came to the show in Season 2 with a nickname, a commanding personality, and a spending style that made him impossible to ignore. Brandy Passanti called him Rico Suave on camera, and the name fit. Before the show, a drug conviction in 2009 had put him on probation, and while on probation he crossed state lines carrying a firearm he said he had found inside a storage unit he purchased. Transporting a weapon across state lines while on probation was a federal violation, and a judge sentenced him to 45 days in jail, which he served before returning to the show. In February 2013, he was arrested on a drug possession charge and released. That arrest hit differently than the others. He told his fiancée, Elizabeth Metzes, that he felt mentally unstable and asked her to stay with him at his office. She stayed until things appeared to settle and then left. The next morning, he was found dead inside his vehicle, killed by carbon monoxide poisoning. His death was ruled a suicide. He left behind Elizabeth, young children, and a community that had raised money for autism causes in his name.